evening. In preparation for your discussion tonight in your campus groups, I thought I would read you a bit of a story, a bit of an excerpt from a book called Intimate Moments with the Savior by Ken Geyer, and he has written an interesting meditation on the life of Zacchaeus. That's the character, the Bible character that we were looking at on Sunday. And I thought I would like to read it for you just to kind of set the tone and create a bit of an atmosphere for your discussion here this evening. I must admit I was thinking of doing it in my Mr. Rogers voice, but I didn't want to put you all to sleep. So pay attention, but you might even want to close your eyes and listen to this reading by Ken Geyer. Jericho, surrounded by palms, scented with balsam groves, dates, palm, honey, myrrh, and balsam from a continuous caravan of exports to the east. For the Roman government, the city is a lush center of taxation, plump, ripe, fragrant with revenue. And knee-deep in the harvest are the tax collectors, making sure the proper due is rendered unto Caesar, and in the process, a denarius or two rendered unto themselves. It is early spring in Jericho, and a chill clings to the yawning shadows that stretch across the city. For many, the eastern sun is a freshly minted coin of opportunity. But commerce is far from the minds of the crowd that mingles with the morning shadows. For this dawn brings with it something more than the promise of commerce. It brings the promise of a Messiah. Jesus has come to Jericho. The crowd swells, eddies of anticipation swirl about and gather in strength. The squeeze of the multitude grows claustrophobic as the more curious elbow for position. But for one man, elbows aren't enough. He is Zacchaeus, a short man. So short he can't see over the crowd, so short he has to climb a tree to catch a glimpse of the procession. Somehow this short man has survived growing up in a tall world, growing up the object of stares, growing up the brunt of jokes, growing up the kid who got pushed around. In the jostled process of growing up, a part of his childhood was trodden underfoot, and that tender part of him died, crushed under the calloused and often cruel feet of the tall. And yet he carries that stepped-on part of himself everywhere he goes, even up the stout trunk of that sycamore tree. At last he's made it to the top in society, chief tax collector, king of the hill, controlling commerce, king of the hill greasing his greedy little palms with the sweat of the businessman's brow, king of the hill looking down over Jericho. And true, Zacchaeus has power, and he has wealth, but the stature he sought among others has eluded him, and so has friendship. But Zacchaeus has heard stories about this Jesus who was a friend of tax collectors, who ate and drank with them and stayed in their homes, who changed the life of Levi, a tax collector at Capernaum, for whom Levi left a lucrative career. He left everything, and not for higher wages, but for no wages at all. This Jesus must be some kind of a man. There's even talk of him being the Messiah. The thought captivates Zacchaeus, a Messiah who's friend of tax collectors? And with the schoolboy's eagerness, he shinnies up the sycamore tree to see him. Zacchaeus crawls out on a limb for a better look. He marvels at the total lack of pomp and ceremony surrounding Jesus. Nothing like a king, and yet something about him is so regal. All eyes follow Jesus as he parts the sea of spectators on his way to that sycamore tree. And Zacchaeus feels the darkness of his soul shrinking back because Jesus is looking at him. For years he has rendered under Caesar, now he must render under Christ an account of himself. And his soul knows that the account isn't good. The ledger is filled with entries of money extorted, money under the table, money skimmed off the top, money, money, money. That's the bottom line for Zacchaeus, the bottom line of a bankrupt life. But the Savior isn't looking for an audit. He's looking for something else. He searches Zacchaeus' eyes to find that stepped on part of his life. And on it he sees every footprint, every heel mark. Jesus is moved with compassion for the little boy who had to grow up in a big man's world. Zacchaeus, he calls him by name and asks for a place to stay. And in the same way you would welcome a friend you have yearned to see for a long time, Zacchaeus jumps down and welcomes Jesus into his home. From behind the barriers he has erected around his heart, a flood of repentant feelings bursts forth, feelings that had been dammed up for years. Zacchaeus goes out on still another limb. What took a lifetime to accumulate, one sentence of devotion liquidates, and not by a token 10%, half to the poor, fourfold to the defrauded. Look closely, witness the miracle, a camel passing through the eye of a needle. Isn't that great? I love that story, and I find the story of Zacchaeus just a fascinating one. And hopefully this reading by Ken Geyer puts it in a bit of perspective for us and helps us to understand the context a little bit. But as you discuss some things here this evening in your group, I want you to focus in on one particular thought, that the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. That, of course, is the key verse in this whole passage. The Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. And I'd like you to play around with this question. If I'm not fishing, am I really a follower? Am I really a follower if I'm not fishing? But by that I mean, if we are not really engaging in the mission of God, seeking and saving lost people, are we really following? And perhaps a little bit later on, you can even share some names and thoughts about people that you know in your life who might be a little bit like Zacchaeus, very distant from God. And perhaps you could pray for them, that God would find them. And maybe He can use you in that process. Have a great study tonight.